Hello everyone, you're watching the Beats Save the World YouTube channel. Today, I want to give my opinion on whether you should mix in mono or mix in stereo, okay? And before I do so, I want to give a couple of disclaimers, okay? I want to say that I would be happy to be proven wrong. Like, if you disagree with me, honestly, like, I don't mind. Like, leave your comment below. I'd love to hear more perspectives on this. Like, if I get proven wrong, I'll completely admit it, you know? I'm not claiming that I'm the god of mixing or something and that what I say is like 100% true or something like that. This is just my opinion and my experience mixing my songs and mixing other people's works. So if you have a point that I'm not considering, I'd honestly love to hear it. Like, I'd love it if people disagree with me. I want to hear other perspectives. This is just my perspective of why I personally don't mix in mono, even though I know that people like to. And I'm going to kind of explain why. But again, if it works for you, I'd love to know why. And I might be wrong on this. So I personally don't do it, but if it works for you, then awesome. Like, keep doing it. Do what works for you. This is just kind of my thoughts and why I don't, all right? So for people who are not mixers, people who are not producers, I should probably explain what I mean by mixing in mono versus mixing in stereo. So most music that you listen to, think about it if you're on headphones, okay? One headphone goes on the right ear and one headphone goes on the left ear, okay? What you may not realize is that the sound that's coming to the left ear is different from the sound coming to the right ear, okay? So your ears are getting different information, and this makes the sound more real, because in real life, the sound waves that enter one ear are not exactly the same as the other ear. So it creates more depth perception. It sounds more real if both your ears are getting slightly different information. So a stereo sound means that when you're listening to something, the information being fed to one ear is different from the information to the other ear. And then a mono sound means that both ears are getting the same information. And if you're mixing in stereo, you're hearing kind of the final version. You're hearing what it would sound like when both channels are different. And if you switch to mixing in mono, if you're listening to the mono version, those two channels are added together and the same thing is sent to both ears, okay? So that's kind of what it means to mix in mono or stereo. If you're mixing in mono, you're adding the channels together and listening to the same thing in both channels, whereas mixing in stereo, you're hearing different information, different audio being sent to both ears, okay? So the first reason why I don't mix in mono, and this is kind of the overall kind of view of it, but I'm going to get into some of the specific arguments I hear and then give my thoughts on that. But just the main reason why I don't mix in mono is because the way that I mix and the way that I produce a song in general is I listen to it and I try to, hear, does it sound good to me? If it does, then that section is well on its way. If there's something I don't like about it, then I really focus on it and I think, well, why don't I like it, okay? To me, the mixing process and even the producing process is iterative, meaning that it's like I'm following the same steps over and over. It's really just about listening to what I have and then asking myself, what do I think of it? If I like it, then it's probably good, and then if there's something that needs to be changed, then I'll do so. So here's where the mixing in mono versus stereo comes in. Generally, when I listen to something in mono, it's not going to sound great to me. I'm going to listen to that, and if I didn't know that it was in mono, I'll listen and I'll think, something is off there, like it just doesn't sound good. So my issue with mixing in mono is that when I'm listening to my song, it's like I'm expecting it to not sound good, It's like I have to kind of put this block in my brain and say, like, yeah, it doesn't really sound good, but it's because it's in mono. It'll sound way better when I switch to stereo. But I don't really like to have that block. I'd rather know that if it sounds bad, that means there's actually a problem, instead of being like, well, it sounds bad because it's in mono, let me try to get it to, sound as good as it can in mono, and then it'll sound way better. Like, I prefer to have the feeling that the only way it's going to sound better is if I change something, that I'm not just expecting, yeah, it'll get way better later on. Because often I feel like if you have the attitude that it's going to get way better once you do step X, then you do that eventually, and you're like, oh, it's not as good as I thought it would be. Like, you expected that it would get way better, but then it actually doesn't. So I prefer to always be listening to as close to the final product as possible, so that then when there's a problem, I know that there's actually a problem, and I'm not kind of fooling myself into thinking it'll sound better once it's in stereo. So that's kind of reason number one. Now, I kind of want to get into some of the arguments of why people say that they want to mix in mono, and if you have an argument that I haven't covered, or if you have a rebuttal, please leave a comment on it. I'd love to be proven wrong. I'm not saying that I know everything, but let me just go over some of the reasons that I see people giving for why they should mix in mono and kind of my thoughts on that, okay? One thing that people say is that if you mix in mono, your sound will be better on mono systems. So, phone speakers, for example, there might only be one phone speaker, so you're not getting different information to both ears. So a phone speaker is mono. So people say that if you mix in mono, you're going to sound better on stuff like phone speakers because you've been doing adjustments to make the mono sound as good as possible, right? Like you know exactly what the mono sounds like, and you've been trying to optimize that. So by the time your song is done, it'll sound better on mono speakers. Now, I agree that your song will sound better on mono speakers if you mix in mono. However, my perspective on this is that I don't really care that much how my song sounds coming out of a cell phone. It depends on how much. Like, I don't want it to sound like trash coming through a cell phone, but to me, a cell phone is never going to do it justice anyway. So as long as it sounds remotely professional, that's good enough for me when it comes from a cell phone. And then if you have like a higher end speaker, like a speaker that's mono, but it's not a cell phone, then in my opinion, it's still not going to do it justice anyway because it's going to be mono. So again, I don't really care that much about optimizing it for that speaker because to me, you're not going to get the full experience anyway. So I'd rather just tell people don't listen to my music on a mono speaker. I don't see why you would need to. Like, most speaker systems are stereo anyway. Headphones are stereo. So it's like that. The ability to optimize slightly for a mono system to me isn't that important. I'd rather focus on how most people are going to be listening to it, which is not through a cell phone speaker or not through a mono speaker in general. So I agree, your mix will sound better through a mono speaker if you mix in mono, but I don't really care that much about that. One other point I want to raise, though, is if you're going to mix in stereo like I do, I want to kind of explain how you avoid phase cancellation. So phase cancellation is where you have a sound in one ear and then that same sound in the other ear, but in the other ear, the polarity is the opposite. So then when you add them together in mono, it kind of cancels itself out and sounds really weird, or it just disappears. So generally, this isn't something that we want. We don't want something to be absent in the mono channel when we wanted it there in the first place. You don't want to switch to mono and then a sound disappears, that. So how do we avoid that if you're going to mix in stereo? Because that is one advantage of mixing in mono, is that you'll be very aware of phase cancellation. So what I would say is if you're going to mix in stereo like I would do, make sure you're periodically switching to the mono channel to just check it, okay? So that's what I prefer to do. I don't like mixing in mono, but I check the mono channel every so often just to make sure it's not a complete mess. For my goals, what works better is I mix everything in stereo and I just check the mono channel before I, release it. I listen to the full thing in mono. So there's an easy way to do that in most audio programs. You can just combine the two channels and you listen in mono and just make sure it sounds decent. And in my experience, if you mix it really well in stereo and you're aware of what phase cancellation is and you're trying to avoid it, generally it'll sound pretty good in mono. It won't be optimized for mono. It won't be as good in mono as if you mixed it for that, but it will be better in stereo in my opinion. And then if there's any phase cancellation, you'll notice it when you check the mono channel. So it's just a check that you have to do, and then you can tell if there's something really messed up. In my opinion, it's not worth mixing the whole thing in mono just to avoid that. You can just fix that by just doing a mono check at the very end, and that's what I do. Okay, so that's one argument. And feel free to leave your comments. I'd love it if you disagree. I just want to know your reasons. Okay, so number 2. People will say that if you mix in mono, your mix will actually sound better in stereo. Okay, so they're not just claiming that it'll sound better on a cell phone. They're actually claiming that if you mix in mono, that's how you get it to sound better in stereo. That it'll sound better in stereo even if you mix in mono, okay? I personally don't agree with this, and I'll go into some of the mechanics. So one reason why they say this, people say this because if you mix in stereo, then you'll hear fewer conflicting frequencies, because if you pan one instrument to one side and another instrument to another side, so if you have one instrument that's more in one ear and another in the other ear, they conflict less, right? So you won't notice, people will argue, people who are in support of mixing in mono will argue that you won't notice the conflicts as much when you're listening in stereo, and that if you mix in mono, you'll hear those conflicts more clearly because all the instruments are together in the same speaker. So that'll help you identify where you need to EQ. It'll help you identify, people will say that that'll help you identify when you have to take out certain frequencies so that instruments are not conflicting, okay? Here's my perspective on that. To me, if instruments don't sound like they're conflicting in stereo, then in my opinion, they're not really a problem. So let's say you have your guitar panned to one side and you have your piano panned to the other side, and they sound like they're not really conflicting. If you switch to mono, all of a sudden they'll sound like they are. So people would say like, well, you should have EQ'd that. But in my opinion, if they sounded good when they were panned to the sides, then I don't think it's really an issue. Like, I don't think you need to EQ. And like, okay, people would say like, okay, well, maybe you don't need to EQ it, but wouldn't it sound better if you do? In my opinion, not necessarily, okay? Because here's the thing. How do you choose how much you should EQ something, okay? How do you choose that? Because we're not saying that when you're mixing in stereo that you don't EQ anything at all. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that when you're in mono, you know, you're preventing frequencies from conflicting, and then we switch to stereo, then you just let them conflict. That's not what we're saying, okay? So we will still deal with conflicts, but what I want to get across is that when you're dealing with conflicts during mixing, you're trying to balance two things. You're trying to keep the instrument sounding natural, okay, while also reducing conflicts, and you're always trying to find that balance where they still sound natural, but they're not conflicting against each other. They're not all in the same frequency, okay? So you kind of take certain frequencies away so that you don't have so much conflict in those frequencies, because that creates muddiness, okay? So the thing is, though, you can overdo this. If you EQ stuff too aggressively to just get rid of all conflict, then the problem is you'll often end up with a mix that just, it may be very clear. You can hear exactly what's going on, but you may find that your mix just sounds cold. Like, it doesn't sound like you're actually in the room. It sounds like too synthetic, you know? It sounds too sterile. That's what I mean. Like, the notes might be really clear, you know, everything, you can hear it, you know, perfectly clearly. But if you over EQ'd it, you may find that it's just not pleasant to listen to. It sounds less like a song. So whether you're mixing in stereo or mono, no matter what your technique is, you're always trying to EQ stuff enough so that it's not conflicting, but you're not trying to overdo it, because if you overdo it and you EQ it too much, it'll sound like it's not natural, okay? So whether you're mixing in mono or stereo, you're trying to find that balance of being natural but also clear, okay? And then my perspective is I think you can find that balance more easily if you mix in stereo. Here's why. You'll get more conflicts when you're mixing in mono, okay? So that'll encourage you to EQ more aggressively, because you're hearing this and you're like, wow, that's really unclear. Like, these instruments are fighting against each other. I want them to blend better, right? So you're going to EQ, you're going to think there's a real problem when there isn't necessarily, and you're going to probably EQ more aggressively when you're listening in mono than you would have if it were stereo. And I don't think this is always a good thing. I think that when you're finding that balance, you can either find the balance in mono or you can find it in stereo. And I think the balance in stereo is more accurate, because that's how most people are listening to your music. So what I'm saying is that you'll get a different result if you're optimizing the mono mix. And in my opinion, when you're optimizing the mono mix, it'll be more aggressively EQ'd. But I don't think that that's the correct version. To me, the correct version is the one that you care about more. And like, if you optimize it for how it sounds in stereo, in my opinion, that'll make your stereo mix sounds better. So what I'm saying is that I don't believe that optimizing a mono mix automatically optimizes a stereo mix, because you might be over EQing, because in mono your frequencies conflict with each other more, because you don't have the panning to save you. You can't just, when you're listening in mono, you can't just pan piano to one side and guitar to the other side. And then also, often, like, if you're mixing in mono, you might be less inclined to try creative stereo stuff, like moving from one ear to the other ear and then back while you're producing, because, you know, that's not going to be heard. You know, you don't get that satisfaction of, like, doing some creative panning, because you're not going to hear that, okay? So the ability to be creative with your panning, I feel like you kind of, if you mix in mono and then you handle the panning afterward, panning meaning like putting the instruments to left channel or right channel, you don't have to hard pan. It might be like 30% right or it might be 30% left, right? But to me, when you mix in mono, you rush the panning stage. In my opinion, you won't be as creative with the panning because you're doing it all at the end, and then like you're doing all of your panning in the last step instead of being something that you think about the entire time. One more thing I want to mention, and why again I think that having the best mono mix does not mean you have the best stereo mix, okay? The balance of instruments will actually be different from mono to stereo. So if you have a perfectly balanced mix in mono, you might find that some instruments are too loud when you go to stereo. Let me explain why. Think about, let's do a thought experiment, okay? Imagine that you have two instruments in your mix, okay? One of them is panned hard to the left, okay? And one of them is dead center, okay? And let's say that the one that's hard left pan, so it'll be completely in the left channel. The one that's hard left will be at 100% volume in the left channel, and of course 0 volume in the right channel. And then the one in the center is going to be at 50% volume, okay? So you have instrument A, which is hard pan to the left, 100% volume, and instrument B, which is 50% volume in both channels. So it's in the center, okay? If you listen to this in mono, they would be exactly the same volume, okay? Here's why. To convert a stereo mix to a mono mix, you add the channels together. So for instrument A, you're adding 100% in the left channel to 0% in the right channel for a total of 100%, okay? For the other instrument, you're adding 50% in one channel to 50% in the other channel for a total of 100%, okay? So they would be the exact same volume in the mono channel. But now in stereo, I would argue that instrument A is way louder. The instrument that's hard panned and at 100% is going to be way louder. Here's why. How much energy is the speaker actually working, right? Essentially, instrument B is like someone yelling at you from the front, okay? So you're getting 50% volume in both ears, right? It's a fairly comfortable volume level, right? Like neither ear is receiving that much. But instrument A, it's like they're yelling into just one ear at 100% volume. Do this experiment yourself. I'm telling you, 100% volume into just one ear sounds way louder than 50% volume into both ears, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that if your mix is perfectly balanced in mono, then the instruments that are panned to one side, though, they're going to sound louder than they did in the mono mix. And then you might have to rebalance once you switch to stereo. So did you even accomplish anything in the mono mixing? Like, I guess you could just make sure everything is panned to the center while you're mixing in mono to avoid this problem. But then once you handle the panning later on when you switch to stereo, don't you have to kind of remix it anyway? So like, you end up with this kind of situation where even if you mixed in mono, you still have to make adjustments in stereo. So, and that's fine, but it wasn't the point that we were trying to argue that what aren't people trying to make the point that if you make the perfect mono mix, that'll automatically be the perfect stereo mix. And just my position is that that's not necessarily true. I think that if you optimize your mono mix, it'll sound the best on mono speakers, but not necessarily the best on stereo. And if you mix in stereo, you're optimizing it for stereo speakers and not necessarily the best on mono speakers. So that was my perspective on why I personally don't mix in mono, but I would love to be proven wrong, honestly. Like, feel free to leave your thoughts. Like, I honestly, like, I'm trying to keep my ego out of this. If there's something that I'm really missing, I genuinely would love to hear about it. Just leave your thoughts. If you mix in mono, I'd love to hear your rationale. Thank you so much for watching anyway. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I guess I'll talk to you next time. Have a good day.